I met David online. He was a member of a number of interest groups, an avid practitioner of male metrosexual fashion, a kayaking enthusiast, a coin collector, and a racquetball player. He hailed from the Midwest, had a master's in creative writing, and enjoyed visiting the bar scenes on the weekends. I could have met David through any of those facets of his personality, could have bumped into him among the throngs of stalls at a flea market, or in the thumping, neon-lit enclosure of a club, or caught his gaze in one of the local parks as he readied for a day of paddling and sightseeing in the dead of summer. I could have, but I didn't. No. I met David online, on a board for local gay men. That's when I knew he was the one I'd been looking for. I'm not a young man, not like David. Where he is in his late 20s, I am nearly 30 years his senior. Where his body seemed carefully carved like a brassy statue, lined by inner glow. Mine is creased, sagging, and fragile. He wears a closed, cropped beard, full and dark, but I am clean-shaven. His hair is carefully and fashionably attended to, short on the sides, long on the top, and a dab of molding wax to seize it at the side. But mine is long, thin, and starched. Never was there such a contrast as us, young and old, beautiful and mundane. But I knew I wanted him all the same. The beauty of such a connection as mine and David is that should he have decided to decline my offer to meet, it would have hardly broken my heart. We would have simply passed by each other along our own paths, never fated to cross, and we would have faded into each other's history, little more than footnotes. The web, after all, affords a spectrum of anonymity, unheard of until its advent. And it is a dial that one is more than able to adjust with each new face upon the screen. It would be a lie to say that I wasn't nervous. After all, it was my first time with a man, and rejection, anonymous or not, always stings. But I could have continued my search for someone like David, even if it couldn't properly be him. Driven by this, I carefully worded a direct message, and, having guessed his schedule based on his post history, sent it when I thought he would be most active. As luck would have it, there was a reply in my inbox not 15 minutes later, and we began to speak. David and I arranged to meet the next week. Some may think that I would be cowardly in my approach. After all, I distinguished him before as something of a god, something beautiful, something extraordinary. But for his sake, as well as mine, I was as honest as I could be. He knew my age from the first message I sent him. He knew my occupation and my first name. I even sent him a picture, albeit one taken a year or so prior. David knew all that he needed to know to understand, at least foundationally, who I was. Honesty and integrity were core to what I wanted from David, paramount even. To pretend to be something I am not would be to ruin my own needs altogether. We messaged very little in the week leading up to our meeting. It was not that I didn't want to speak to David. No, I wanted nothing more. But I felt as though I needed to save the conversation. I wanted to hear him speak to me. I wanted to watch the way his lips formed the words, the way his teeth flashed, the way his hands moved to support the gravity of his sentences. I could almost picture it in my head, and when I did, my mind was flooded with a strange mixture of anxiety and happiness that only intimate plans could bring. I often thought of my youth when that happened, of how wrong my father and mother would think it to have relations with a man. How disgusted all those boys from my school would have been. Indeed, even I had spent 50 years of my life carefully treading the right side of the line, burying myself between the thighs of women and loving them the best I could. But David had affirmed in me that there was something more than what I had known and what I'd done. It felt good to cut against the grain that had been instilled in me. It felt freeing. And at my age, one can't put a price on that fleeting sense of being given a choice and choosing wrong. David and I met at Cafe on Elm. I spotted him on the street, sitting in the patio section. With a wave of his hand, he signaled me and I approached, taking the iron-backed chair opposite. He wore a gray suit, slightly rumpled, and a purple undershirt that contrasted with the orange glow of his skin as the sun burned into the building. The curve of his chin was supple, more effeminate than in the pictures I'd seen. His hands were slender and callous. He was divine. I ordered a bowl of Torin, David a BLT, with a side of French fries, crinkle cut. We each had a glass of Pinot Grigio and talked as we waited for our food to arrive. I told David about my early life, the boarding school, the summer trips to Scotland with my aunt, my mother and father's subsequent divorce. I skimmed over my employment at the college as an adjunct nursing professor and my move into the position of office work to get away from the bustle of classrooms. I even covered my brief marriage. A year with a woman named Margaret who eventually left me to move to California with another man. David smiled when appropriate and, at other times, offered consolation. He was perfectly attentive. By the time I'd finished, our food had arrived, and David and I moved our chairs subtly closer to one another. He carefully plucked the toothpick from his sandwich and began to eat. I watched, then remembered myself and dug in. At one point, David paused, wiped his mouth with the edge of his napkin, and spoke. "So, have you ever been with someone like..." He paused, chewing on his words. "Have you ever been with someone like this before?" I was caught off guard. In all honesty, I hadn't anticipated him asking. Suddenly, the anxiety overrode the happiness. I haven't. This is a first for me as well. If we're being honest, I've always wanted to do this, but it never felt comfortable. But now, I don't have so much of a reputation to uphold or people to impress. I can do what I want, I think, if that makes sense. David just smiled and nodded. "Well, I'm happy for you too. If I'm not being too pressing, would you mind another question?" I shook my head no. "Does my age bother you? I mean, I don't want to be rude, but you are a bit older than I am. Does that seem strange at all?" It was my turn to smile. "Absolutely not. In fact, I find it flattering." David beamed. There was a reaffirming warmth to it, a proof that we had reached some level in our relationship already where we could talk, man to man, about what we wanted, what we needed. I took the chance to urge him to tell me more about himself. He happily agreed. When we had finished our dinner, David and I rose from our seats and walked to our cars. Despite the cool evening settling in, I felt a heat around my neck as we stood on the sidewalk next to his Lexus. He wasn't saying anything, just standing and stroking his chin. I took it as a sign. "David, would you mind?" I mean, would you like to come back to my place?" There was a silence at first, but then a boyish smile broke out across his face. Absolutely. The heat didn't dissipate, even as I drove. We arrived at my home almost half an hour later. It is by no means big, but it is passably large, artfully decorated, and, above all, sequestered on a small parcel of land at the city limits. I parked my car and David parked his, and together we made our way into the house. I had saved a bottle of Riesling for the occasion. I turned on the lights, poured a couple of glasses, and moved into the living room with David on my heels. Out of the public eye, he was more affectionate. Light touches on the back of my hip as he moved around me, a twinkle in his eye and a suggestive tone in his words. He took a seat on my couch, the black leather folding underneath his weight with the slightest sound, and I took the nearest chair. We talked for hours, taking turns elaborating and asking questions. We talked of life again. We talked of goals, but mostly we talked of desires. The more I drank, the more I began to notice the way he looked at me. Wanting, hungry. He didn't say it, but in his words there was a question. The question. After I downed my third glass, I moved to his side of the couch. There was hardly a breath before our mouths met. He tasted of apples, his tongue sweet and teasing. I took the lead and pressed my hand to the back of his head. Breaking it off, I planted kisses along his cheek, against his ear, and trailed down his jawline. I let my tongue lead when it wanted, and felt his body tense and ease in rising passion. My fingers found the buttons of his suit jacket, then those of the dress shirt beneath. His chest bare, I trailed further down and felt his fingers running through my hair and urged me forward. I paused along the top of his pants, teething lightly at its edge, and felt him instinctively push his legs wider. My hand fumbled with his belt and then the button hidden beneath. Then, carefully, I pulled them away. A single glance upward, a meeting of our eyes, reaffirmed his trust. I took him in my mouth. I was soft at first, and slow, but the movement of his hips urged, pleading for more. I brought my teeth down harder around the base with each thrust, and he moved to accommodate. He moaned in ecstasy, his body shaking, and I pushed on. As the skin broke, I felt a rush of blood, and David's body tensed, then eased with it. His hands pushed me down further, shakily. I clutched my teeth tight, severing what remained, and slowly pulled my head away. David was sweating and wincing, but his face said all there was to say about his pleasure. I chewed and swallowed. His body heaved. He raised his thumb and carefully traced the outline of my mouth. As before, I took it in and pressed my teeth down. It was harder than before. The bones crunched beneath my teeth, snapping as I tugged. I tasted salt and copper on my tongue. David moaned, but it was not a painful moan, and I felt the chewy extent of his muscle give way. This I did not eat. This I did not swallow. This I plucked free and saved for later. David did not die, if that's what you're thinking. Not then, at least. We, of course, prepared for this, and time was of the essence. Cauterization was painful, especially when done correctly. But even through the pain, there was this glow from David. the glow of gratification. I could feel it too, radiating from myself, burning in my stomach. When he was safe, lotioned and bandaged, I laid my head on his shoulder. David was still panting, while his face was a mixture of sour pain. He sighed contentedly as any lover. "Was it good for you?" I nodded. "And you?" "Amazing." David moved in afterward, telling most others that he was leaving the area. No one questioned him. Everyone knew he was the adventurous type. He was still active on his own, and I still continued my work. But when we felt the need to consummate, we did so as we pleased. There came a time, though, when David knew that the end was nearing, and I saw it in the way his body dwindled, his fingers reduced to stubs, his skin marked by the burns that saved his life. There came a day when we sat at the kitchen table and spoke in hushed whispers, despite being entirely alone. He told me he wasn't scared. I told him it would be another adventure. Afterward, he severed the final means of contact he had with the world. I ate David for months. Steaks, soups, and all manners of dishes. I prepared him for every meal in some way. With each meal, I relived the experience. David was beautiful. David was amazing. David was delicious. David was my first, but he was not my last. In what has been nearly a decade since his death, I have had and seized the opportunity 2 more times. Each time it was gratifying. Each time my partner felt as much ecstasy as I, up until the end. But none have ever compared to David. None ever can. I met David online, and we opened each other's worlds to new expansive horizons. I had never taken a man's life. I never have. But I have been given 3 lives, and I have cherished them all. Which leads me to the reason I'm writing this. I am a man whose lust has been sated, but who is still incomplete. I am a man who has been frivolous and dangerous and thrived because of it. I know now that I can die with no regrets. But can you say the same? I met David online. That's when I knew he was what I had been looking for. My name is Richard, and now you have met me. I want to meet you in person, and we can go from there, piece by piece.